I'm going to turn over the mic to my colleague and friend, Alan Grostephan, and he will take it on from here. Alan, please.
Thank you for being here. I'm going to read a poem, but before I did, I thought I would, tell a really brief story and talk about how poetry sort of addresses this story and addresses, I think, what we're all feeling right now, which is pain, right, and a type of despair. In 2008, when Barack Obama won the presidency, I was elated. I was in graduate school. I watched TV of the election. I watched Fox News so I could watch the other side lose. And there were parties everywhere. Everybody was dancing. Everybody was singing. I was among graduate students. And we had all this hope. The theme of the election was hope. And one of my friends was so excited about this that he failed his oral exams for his PhD. And the question that he failed was, they asked him to explain realism, and he just blanked. He was just too excited that Obama had won the presidency. And that was sort of the spirit at the time. And then here we are 8 years later, and despair would be the theme, right? And I think the candidates that we have now and the type of debate that's going on right now it's frustrating, right? So I think the question I wanted to address briefly is just how can poetry help? And I thought, on the most basic level, why we pick up a poem, why we read a poem or write a poem is pleasure, right? I think we begin with pleasure and we end with pleasure. And that language comes from song. And we respond to song and to singing, and it's very, with our bodies, right? In this very visceral way. So I think that's the most important thing. I think the second thing is it somehow gives us a type of completion. It has a beginning and an end. And we live in this sort of state of unfinished things, half thoughts, half emotions, right? Unfinished in this sort of chaotic condition. And to me, a poem does give you a type of order, right? Whether it's a story or an argument, it contains that. The final thing, and I'll get to my poem because I think the poem that I'm going to read, at least for me, does all three of these things, is I think poetry is supposed to wake us up, right? And to make us aware of something that we had no other way of finding without the poem. And I think of the famous Franz Kafka quote, "A book must be the axe for the frozen sea within us." And I think a poem must be the axe for the frozen sea within us. The poem I want to read is by a poet named Carl Phillips, and I remember seeing him read this poem at a rather dark time for me, for a number of reasons. And I found it extremely uplifting. It's not necessarily a positive poem, but it seemed to contain all these sort of conflicting and just disordered feelings that I had at the time. And the only thing I want to say about it, it's a somewhat difficult poem, and I think that shouldn't worry you. I think you can feel what the poem is trying to do. The recurrent line, the chorus, is there's an art to everything. And I think that line works two ways. On one hand, he's saying that there's an art to your suffering, there's an art to what you can do with painful things, with dark things, particularly with art. And I think he's also saying that there's an art to deceit, there's artifice. And he wants that to work both ways, that there's also this story that is in a way unfair and false. So I'll read this and then we'll move ahead. Civilization. There's an art to everything. How the rain means April and an ongoingness like that of song until at last it ends. A centuries-old set of silver handbells that once an altar boy swung, processing. You're the same wilderness you've always been, slashing through the briars, the bracken of your invasive self. So he said in a dream. But the rest of it, all the rest, was waking. More often than not, the next extravagance. Two blackamoor statues, each mirroring the other, each hoisting forever upward this burden of hand-painted, carved by hand peacock feathers. Don't you know it? Don't you know I love you? He said. He was shaking. He said, I love you. There's an art to everything. What I've done with this life, what I'd meant not to do, or would have meant, maybe, had I understood, though I have no regrets. Not the broken but still flowering dogwood, not the honey locust either, not even the ghost walnut with its non-branches, whose every shadow is memory. Memory, as he said to me once, that's all garbage down the river now. Turning, but as the utterly lost, because addicted do, resigned all over again. It must only look like leaving. There's an art to everything, even turning away. Now, how eventually, even hunger can become a space to live in. How they made out of shamelessness something beautiful for as long as they could. Our next reader is a freshman at Agnes Scott College. She's been writing since she was in 4th grade. Her poetry has been published by Eber and Wine, The Wren's Nest, and the Atlanta Youth Writers Institute. Let's welcome Mitchell Cameron.